The Wars of the Jews are the history of the destruction of Jerusalem, Book 6, containing the interval about 1 month, from the great extremity to which the Jews were reduced to the taking of Jerusalem by Titus. Chapter 1. That the misery still grew worse, and how the Romans made an assault upon the tower of Antonia. Thus did the miseries of Jerusalem grow worse and worse every day, and the seditious were still more irritated by the calamities they were under, even while the famine preyed upon themselves after it had preyed upon the people. And indeed the multitude of carcasses that lay in heaps upon one another was a horrible sight, and produced a pestilential stench, which was a hindrance to those that would make sallies out of the city and fight the enemy. But as those were to go in battle array, who had been already used to 10,000 murders, and must tread upon those dead bodies as they marched along, so were not they terrified, nor did they pity men as they marched over them, nor did they deem this an affront offered to the deceased to be any ill omen to themselves. But as they had their right hands already polluted with the murders of their own countrymen, and in that condition ran out to fight with foreigners, they seemed to me to have cast a reproach upon God himself, as if he were too slow in punishing them. For the war was not now gone on with as they had any hope of victory, for they had gloried after a brutish manner in that despair of deliverance they were already in. And now the Romans, although they were greatly distressed in getting together their materials, raised their banks in 21 days, after they had cut down all the trees that were in the country that adjoined to the city, and that for 90 furlongs round about, as I have already related. That's about 10 miles around the city of Jerusalem. That's an editorial note. And truly the very view itself of the country was a melancholy thing, for those places which were before adorned with trees and pleasant gardens were now become a desolate country every way, and its trees were all cut down, nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea and the most beautiful suburbs of the city, and now saw it as a desert, but lament and mourn sadly at so great a change. For the war had laid all the signs of beauty quite waste, nor if anyone that had known the place before had come on a sudden to it now, would he have known it again. But though he were at the city itself, yet would he have inquired for it notwithstanding. And now the banks were finished, and they afforded a foundation for fear both to the Romans and to the Jews. For the Jews expected that the city would be taken unless they could burn those banks, as did the Romans expect that, if these were once burnt down, they should never be able to take it. For there was a mighty scarcity of materials, and the bodies of the soldiers began to fail with such hard labors, as did their souls faint with so many instances of ill success. Nay, the very calamities themselves that were in the city proved a greater discouragement to the Romans than those within the city, for they found the fighting men of the Jews to be not at all mollified among such their sore afflictions, while they had themselves perpetually less and less hopes of success, and their banks were forced to yield to the stratagems of the enemy, their engines to the firmness of their wall, and their closest fights to the boldness of their attack. And what was their greatest discouragement of all, they found the Jews' courageous souls to be superior to the multitude of the miseries they were under, by their sedition, their famine, and the war itself, insomuch that they were ready to imagine that the violence of their attacks was invincible, and that the alacrity they showed would not be discouraged by their calamities. For what would not those be able to bear if they should be fortunate who turn their very misfortunes to the improvement of their valor? These considerations made the Romans to keep a stronger guard about their banks than they had formerly done. But now John and his party took care for securing themselves afterward, even in case this wall should be thrown down, and fell to their work before the battering rams were brought against them. Yet they did not compass what they had endeavored to do, but as they were gone out with their torches, they came back under a great discouragement before they came near the banks. And the reasons were these: that in the first place their conduct did not seem to be unanimous, but they went out in distinct parties, and at distinct intervals, and after a slow manner, and timorously, and, to say all in a word, without a Jewish courage. For they were now defective in what is peculiar to our nation, that is, in boldness, in violence of assault, and in running upon the enemy altogether, and in persevering in what they go about, though they do not at first succeed in it. But they now went out in a more languid manner than usual, and at the same time found the Romans set in array and more courageous than ordinary, and that they guarded their banks both with their bodies and their entire armor, and this to such a degree on all sides, that they left no room for the fire to get among them, and that every one of their souls was in such good courage that they would sooner die than desert their ranks. For besides their notion that all of their hopes were cut off, in case these their works were once burnt, the soldiers were greatly ashamed that subtlety should quite be too hard for courage, madness for armor, multitude for skill, and Jews for Romans. The Romans had now also another advantage, in that their engines for siege cooperated with them in throwing darts and stones as far as the Jews, when they were coming out of the city, whereby the man that fell became an impediment to him that was next to him, as did the danger of going farther make them less zealous in their attempts. For those that had run under the dart, some of them were terrified by the good order and closeness of the enemy's ranks before they came to a close fight, and others were pricked with their spears, and turned back again. At length they reproached one another for their cowardice, and retired without doing anything. This attack was made upon the first day of the month Patamus, or Tammuz. So when the Jews were retreated, the Romans brought their engines, although they had all the while stones thrown at them from the tower of Antonia, and were assaulted by fire and sword, and by all sorts of darts, which necessity afforded the Jews to make use of. For although these had great dependence on their own wall, and a contempt for the Roman engines, yet did they endeavor to hinder the Romans from bringing them. Now these Romans struggled hard, on the contrary, to bring them, as deeming that this zeal of the Jews was in order to avoid any impression to be made on the tower of Antonia, because its wall was but weak and its foundations rotten. However, that tower did not yield to the blows given it from the engines, yet did the Romans bear the impressions made by the enemy's darts which were perpetually cast at them, and did not give way to any of those dangers that came upon them from above, so that they brought their engines to bear. But then, as they were beneath the other, and were sadly wounded by the stones thrown down upon them, some of them threw their shields over their bodies, and partly with their hands, and partly with their bodies, and partly with crows, they undermined its foundations, and with great pains they removed 4 of its stones. Then night came upon both sides, and put an end to this struggle for the present. However, that night the wall was so shaken by the battering rams in that place where John had used his stratagem before, and had undermined their banks, that the ground gave way, and the wall fell down suddenly. When this accident had unexpectedly happened, the minds of both parties were variously affected. For though one would expect that the Jews would be discouraged because this fall of their wall was unexpected by them, and they had made no provision in that case, yet did they pull up their courage because the tower of Antonia itself was still standing, as was the unexpected joy of the Romans at this fall of the wall, soon quenched by the sight that they had another wall, which John and his party had built within. However, the attack of this second wall appeared to be easier than that of the former, because it seemed a thing of greater facility to get up to it through the parts of the former wall that were now thrown down. This new wall appeared to be much weaker than the Tower of Antonia, and accordingly the Romans imagined that it had been erected so much on the sudden that they soon should overthrow it. Yet did not anybody venture now to go up to this wall, for that such as first ventured to do so must certainly be killed. And now Titus, upon consideration of that alacrity of soldiers in war is chiefly excited by hope said by good words, and that exhortations and promises do frequently make men to forget the hazards they run, nay, sometimes to despise death itself, got together the most courageous part of his army, and tried what he could with his men by these methods. O fellow soldiers, said he, to make an exhortation to men to do what hath no peril in it, is on that very account inglorious to such as whom that exhortation is made, and indeed so it is in him that makes the exhortation an argument of his own cowardice also. I therefore think that such exhortations ought then only to be made use of when affairs are in a dangerous condition, and yet are worthy of being attempted by every one themselves accordingly. I am fully of the same opinion with you, that it is a difficult task to go up to this wall, but that it is proper for those that desire reputation for their valor to struggle with difficulties in such cases will then appear, when I have particularly shown that it is a brave thing to die with glory, and that the courage here necessary shall not go unrewarded in those that first begin the attempt. And let my first argument to move you to it be taken from what probably some would think reasonable to dissuade you. I mean the constancy and patience of these Jews, even under their ill successes. For it is unbecoming to you, who are Romans and my soldiers, who have in peace been taught how to make wars, and who have also been used to conquer in those wars, to be inferior to Jews, either in action of the hand or in courage of the soul, and this especially when you are at the conclusion of your victory, and are assisted by God himself. For as to our misfortunes they have been owing to the madness of the Jews, while their sufferings have been owing to your valor, and to the assistance God hath afforded you. For as to the seditious they have been in, with the famine they are under, and the siege they now endure, and the fall of their walls without our engines, what can they be all be but demonstrations of God's anger against them, and of his assistance afforded us? It will not therefore be proper for you either to show yourselves inferior to those to whom you are really superior, or to betray that divine assistance which is afforded you. And indeed, how can it be esteemed otherwise than a base and unworthy thing, that while the Jews, who need not be much ashamed if they be deserted, because they have long learned to be slaves to others, do yet despise death, that they may be so no longer, and do make sallies into the very midst of us frequently, no in hopes of conquering us, but merely for a demonstration of their courage. We who have gotten possession of almost all the world that belongs to either land or sea, to whom it will be a great shame if we do not conquer them, do not once undertake any attempt against our enemies wherein there is much danger, but sit still idle, with such brave arms as we have, and only wait till the famine and fortune to do our business themselves, and this when we have it in our power, with some small hazard, to gain all that we desire. For if we go up to this tower of Antonia, we gain the city. For if there should be any more occasion for fighting against those within the city, which I do not suppose there will, since we shall then be upon the top of the hill, and be upon our enemies before they have taken breath, these advantages promise us no less than a certain and sudden victory. As for myself, I shall at present waive any commendation for those who die in war, and omit to speak of the immortality of those men who are slain in the midst of their martial bravery. Yet cannot I forbear to imprecate upon those who are of a contrary disposition, that they may die in the time of peace, by some distemper or other, since their souls are condemned to the grave, together with their bodies. For what man of virtue is there who does not know that those souls which are severed from their fleshly bodies in battles by the sword are received by the ether, that purest of elements, and joined to that company which are placed among the stars, that they become good demons and propitious heroes, and show themselves as such to their posterity afterwards, while upon those souls that wear away, and with their distempered bodies comes a subterranean night to dissolve them to nothing, and a deep oblivion to take away all the remembrance of them. And this notwithstanding, they be clean from all spots and defilements of this world, so that in this case the soul at the same time comes to the utmost bounds of its life, and of its body, and of its memorial also. But since he hath determined that death is to come of necessity upon all men, a sword is a better instrument for that purpose than any disease whatsoever. Why is it not then a very mean thing for us to not yield up that, to the public benefit, which we must yield up to fate? And this discourse have I made upon the supposition that those who at first attempt to go upon this wall must needs be killed in the attempt, though still men of true courage have a chance to escape even in the most hazardous undertakings. For, in the first place, that part of the former wall that is thrown down is easily to be ascended, and for the newly built wall which is easily destroyed. Do you, therefore, many of you, pull up your courage and set about this work, and do you mutually encourage and assist one another, and this your bravery will soon break the hearts of your enemies, and perhaps such a glorious undertaking as yours may be accomplished without bloodshed. For although it be justly to be supposed that the Jews will try to hinder you at your first beginning to go up to them, yet when you have once concealed yourselves from them and driven them away by force, they will not be able to sustain your efforts against them any longer, though but a few of you prevent them and get over the wall. As for that person who first mounts the wall, I should blush for shame if I did not make him to be envied of the others, by those rewards I would bestow upon him. If such a one escape with his life, he shall have the command of others that are now but his equals, although it be true also that the greatest rewards will accrue to such as die in the attempt. Upon this speech of Titus, the rest of the multitude were affrighted at so great a danger. But there was one, whose name was Sabinus, a soldier that served among the cohorts, an Assyrian by birth, who appeared to be of a great fortitude, both in the actions he had done and the courage of his soul he had shown, although anybody would have thought, before he came to his work, that he was of such a weak constitution of body that he was not fit to be a soldier. For his color was black, his flesh was lean and thin, and lay close together. But there was a certain heroic soul that dwelt in this small body, which body was indeed much too narrow for that peculiar courage which was in him. Accordingly he was the first that rose up, and when he thus spake, quote, I readily surrender up myself to thee, O Caesar. I first ascend the wall, and I heartily wish that my fortune may follow my courage and my resolution. And if some ill fortune grudge me the success of my undertaking, take notice that my ill success will not be unexpected, and that I choose death voluntary for thy sake. When he had said this, and had spread out his shield over his head with his left hand, and Hill with his right hand, drawn his sword, he marched up to the wall just about the 6th hour of the day. There followed him 11 others, and no more, that resolved to imitate his bravery. But still this was the principal person of them all, and went first, as excited by a divine fury. Now those that guarded the wall shot at them from thence, and cast innumerable darts upon them from every side. They also rolled very large stones upon them, which overthrew some of those 11 that were with him. But as for Sabinus himself, he met the darts that were cast at him, and though he was overwhelmed with them, he did not leave off the violence of his attack before he had gotten up on top of the wall and put the enemy to flight. As for the Jews, were astonished at his great strength and the bravery of his soul, and as, withal, they imagined more of them had got upon the wall than really had, they were all put to flight. And now one cannot but complain here of fortune, as still envious at virtue, and always hindering the performance of glorious achievements. This was the case of the man before us, when he had just obtained this purpose, for he then stumbled at a certain large stone and fell down upon it headlong with a very great noise. Upon which the Jews turned back, and when they saw him to be alone, fallen down also, they threw darts at him from every side. However, he got upon his knee and covered himself with his shield, and at the first defended himself against them, and wounded many of those that came near him. But he was soon forced to relax his right hand by the multitude of the wounds that had been given him, till at length he was quite covered over with darts before he gave up the ghost. He was one who deserved a better fate by reason of his bravery, but as might be expected, he fell under so vast an attempt. As for the rest of his partners, the Jews dashed 3 of them to pieces with stones, and slew them as they were gotten up to the top of the wall. The other 8 being wounded were pulled down and carried back to the camp. These things were done on the 3rd day of the month Panemus, or Tammuz. Now 2 days afterward, 12 of those men that were on the forefront and kept watch upon the banks got together and called to them the standard-bearer of the 5th Legion, and 2 others of a troop of horsemen, and 1 trumpeter. These went without noise about the 9th hour of the night through the ruins to the tower of Antonia. When they had cut the throats of the first guards of the place as they were asleep, they got possession of the wall, and ordered the trumpeter to sound his trumpet, upon which the rest of the guard got up on the sudden and ran away, before anybody could see how many they were that had gotten up. And for partly from the fear they were in, and partly from the sound of the trumpet which they heard, they imagined a great number of the enemy were gotten up. But as soon as Caesar heard the signal, he ordered the army to put on their armor immediately, and came thither with his commanders, and first of all ascended, as did the chosen men that were with him. And as the Jews were flying away to the temple, they fell into that mine which John had dug under the Roman banks. Then did the seditious of both sides, of both the bodies of the Jewish army, as well that belonging to John and that belonging to Simon, drive them away, and indeed were no way wanting as to the highest degree of force and alacrity, for they esteemed themselves entirely ruined if once the Romans got into the temple, as did the Romans look upon the same thing as the beginning of their entire conquest. So a terrible battle was fought at the entrance of the temple, while the Romans were forcing their way in order to get possession of that temple, and the Jews were driving them back to the tower of Antonia, in which battle the darts were on both sides useless as well as the spears, and both sides drew their swords and fought it out hand to hand. Now during the struggle the positions of the men were undistinguished on both sides, and they fought at random, the men being intermixed one with another, and confounded by reason of the narrowness of the place, while the noise that was made fell on the ear after an indistinct manner, because it was so very loud. Great slaughter was now made on both sides, and the combatants trod upon the bodies and the armor of those that were dead and dashed them to pieces. Accordingly, to which side soever the battle inclined, those that had the advantage exhorted one another to go on, as did those that were beaten make great lamentation. But still there was no room for flight, nor for pursuit, but disorderly revolutions and retreats, while the armies were intermixed one with another, But those that were in the first ranks were under the necessity of killing or being killed, without any way for escaping. For those on both sides that came behind forced those before them to go on, without leaving any space between the armies. At length the Jews' violent zeal was too hard for the Roman skill, and the battle already inclined entirely that way, for the fight had lasted from the 9th hour of the night till the 7th hour of the day. While the Jews came on in crowds, and had the danger the temple was in for their motive, the Romans having no more here than a part of their army, for those legions on which the soldiers on that side depended were not come up to them. So it was at present, though sufficient by the Romans to take possession of the tower of Antonia. But there was one Julian, a centurion, that came from Bithynia, a man he was of great reputation, whom I had formerly seen in that war, and one of the highest fame, for both his skill in war, his strength of body, and the courage of his soul. This man, seeing the Romans giving ground, in ill a sad condition, for he stood by Titus at the tower of Antonia, leaped out, and himself alone put the Jews to flight. And when they were already conquerors, and made them retire as far as the corner of the inner court of the temple, from him the multitude fled away in crowds, as supposing that neither his strength nor his violent attacks could be those of a mere man. Accordingly he rushed through the midst of the Jews as they were dispersed all abroad, and killed those that he caught. Nor indeed was there any sight that appeared more wonderful in the eyes of Caesar, or more terrible to others than this. However, he himself was pursued by fate, which it all not possible that he, who was but a mortal man, should escape. For as he had shoes all full of thick and sharp nails, as had every one of the other soldiers, so when he ran on the pavement of the temple he slipped and fell down upon his back with a very great noise, which was made by his armor. This made those that were running away to turn back, whereupon those Romans that were in the tower of Antonia set up a great shout, as they were in fear for the man. But the Jews got about him in crowds, and struck at him with their spears and with their swords on all sides. Now he received a great many of the strokes of these iron weapons upon his shield, and often attempted to get up again, but was thrown down by those that struck at him. Yet did he, as he lay along, stab many of them with his sword. Nor was he soon killed, as being covered with his helmet and his breastplate, and all these parts of his body where he might be mortally wounded. He also pulled his neck close to his body, till all his other limbs were shattered, and nobody durst come to defend him. Then he yielded to his fate. Now Caesar was deeply affected on account of this man of so great fortitude, and especially as he was killed in the sight of so many people. He was desirous himself to come to his assistance, but the place would not give him leave, and while such as could have done it were too much terrified to attempt it. Thus when Julian had struggled with death a great while, and had let but a few of those that had given him his mortal wound go off unhurt, he had at last his throat cut, though not without some difficulty, and left behind him a very great fame, not only among the Romans and with Caesar himself, but among his enemies also. Then did the Jews catch up his dead body, and put the Romans to flight again, and shut them up in the tower of Antonia. Now those that most signalized themselves and fought most zealously in this battle of the Jewish side were one Alexis and Gyphius of John's party, and of Simon's party were Malachias and Judas the son of Murto, and James the son of Sosus, the commander of the Idumeans, and of the Zealots 2 brethren, Simon and Judas, the sons of Jairus. Chapter 2. How Titus gave orders to demolish the tower of Antonia, and then persuaded Josephus to exhort the Jews again to a surrender. And now Titus gave orders to his soldiers that were with him to dig up the foundations of the tower of Antonia, and make him a ready passage for his army to come up, while he himself had Josephus brought to him, for he had been informed that on that very day, which was the 17th day of Panemus or Tammuz, the sacrifice called the daily sacrifice had failed, and had not been offered to God for want of men to offer it, and that the people were grievously troubled at it, and commanded him to say the same things to John that he had said before, that if he had any malicious inclination for fighting, he might come out with as many of his men as he pleased in order to fight, without the danger of destroying either his city or temple, but that he desired he would not defile the temple, nor thereby offend against God, that he might, if he pleased, offer the sacrifices which were now discontinued by any of the Jews whom he should pitch upon. Upon this Josephus stood in such a place where he might be heard, not by John only, but by many more, and then declared to them what Caesar had given him in charge, and this in the Hebrew language. So he earnestly prayed to them to spare their own city, to prevent that fire which was just ready to seize upon the temple, and to offer their usual sacrifices to God therein. At these words of his, a great sadness and silence were observed among the people. But the tyrant himself cast many reproaches upon Josephus, with imprecations besides, and at last added this withal, that he did never fear the taking of the city, because it was God's own city. In answer to which Josephus said thus with a loud voice, quote, "To be sure thou hast kept this city wonderfully pure for God's sake. The temple also continues entirely unpolluted. Nor hast thou been guilty of all impiety against him for whose assistance thou hopest. He still receives his accustomed sacrifices. Vile wretch that thou art! If any one should deprive thee of thy daily food, thou wouldst esteem him to be an enemy to thee. But thou hopest to have that God for thy supporter in this war, whom thou hast deprived of his everlasting worship, and thou imputest those sins to the Romans, who to this very time take care to have our laws observed, and almost compel these sacrifices to still be offered to God, which have by thy means been intermitted. Who is there that can avoid groans and lamentations at the amazing change that is made in this city? Since very foreigners and enemies do now correct that impiety which thou hast occasioned, while thou, who art a Jew and was educated in our laws, art become a greater enemy to them than the others. But still, John, it is never dishonorable to repent, and amend that what hath been done amiss, even at the last extremity. Thou hast an instance before thee in Jeconiah, the king of the Jews, if thou hast a mind to save the city, who, when the king of Babylon made war against him, did of his own accord go out of this city before it was taken, and did undergo a voluntary captivity with his family, that the sanctuary might not be delivered up to the enemy, and that he might not see the house of God set on fire, on which account he is celebrated among all the Jews in their sacred memorials, and his memory has become immortal, and will be conveyed fresh down to our posterity through all ages. This, John, is an excellent example in such a time of danger, and I dare venture to promise that the Romans shall still forgive thee. And take notice that I, who make this exhortation to thee, am one of thy own nation. I, who am a Jew, do make this promise to thee, and it will become thee to consider who I am that give thee this counsel, and whence I am derived. For while I am alive, I shall never be in such slavery as to forego my own kindred, and forget the laws of our forefathers. Thou hast indignation at me again, and makest a clamor at me, and reproachest me. Indeed, I cannot deny that I am worthy of worse treatment than all this amounts to, because, in opposition to fate, I make this kind invitation to thee, and endeavor to force deliverance upon those whom God hath condemned. And who is there that does not know what the writings of the ancient prophets contain in them, and particularly that oracle which is just now going to be fulfilled upon this miserable city? For they foretold that this city should be then taken when somebody shall begin the slaughter of his own countrymen. And are not both the city and the entire temple now full of the dead bodies of your countrymen? It is God, therefore, it is God himself who is bringing on this fire, to purge that city and temple by means of the Romans, and is going to pluck up this city, which is full of your pollutions." As Josephus spoke these words with groans and tears in his eyes, his voice was intercepted by sobs. However, the Romans could not but pity the affliction he was under, and wonder at his conduct. But for John and those that were with him, they were but the more exasperated against the Romans on this account, and were desirous to get Josephus also into their power. Yet did that discourse influence a great many of the better sort, and truly some of them were so afraid of the guards set by the seditious that they tarried where they were, but were satisfied that both they and the city were doomed to destruction. Some also there were who, watching a proper opportunity when they might quietly get away, fled to the Romans, of whom there were high priest Joseph and Jesus, and the sons of high priests 3, whose father was Ishmael, who was beheaded in Cyrene, and 4 sons of Matthias, and 1 son of the other Matthias, who ran away after his father's death, and whose father was slain by Simon the son of Gioras, with 3 of his sons, as I have already related. Many also of the other nobility went over to the Romans together with the high priests. Now Caesar not only received these men very kindly in other respects, but knowing they would not willingly live after the customs of other nations, he sent them to Gophna and desired them to remain there for the present, and told them, when he was gotten clear of this war, he would restore each of them to their possessions again, So they cheerfully retired to that small city which was allotted them, without fear of any danger. But as they did not appear, the seditious gave out again that these deserters were slain by the Romans, which was done in order to deter the rest from running away by fear of the like treatment. This trick of theirs succeeded now for a while, as did the like trick before, for the rest were hereby deterred from deserting by fear of the like treatment. However, when Titus had recalled those men from Gophna, he gave orders that they should go round the wall, together with Josephus, and show themselves to the people, upon which a great many fled to the Romans. These men also got in a great number together, and stood before the Romans, and besought the seditious, with groans and tears in their eyes, in the first place, to receive the Romans entirely into the city, and save that their own place of residence again. But that, if they would not agree to such a proposal, they would at least depart out of the temple, and save the holy house for their own use, for that the Romans would not venture to set the sanctuary on fire, but under the most pressing necessity. Yet did the seditious still more and more contradict them, and while they cast loud and bitter reproaches upon these deserters, they also set their engines for throwing of darts and javelins and stones upon the sacred gates of the temple, at due distances from one another, insomuch that all the space round about within the temple might be compared to a burying ground. So great was the number of the dead bodies therein, as might the holy house itself be compared to a citadel. Accordingly these men rushed upon these holy places in their armor, that were otherwise unapproachable, that while their hands were yet warm with the blood of their own people, which they had shed, nay, they proceeded to great transgressions, that the very same indignation which Jews would naturally have against the Romans, had they been guilty of such abuses against them, the Romans now had against Jews, for their impiety in regard to their own religious customs. Nay, indeed, there were none of the Roman soldiers who did not look with a sacred horror upon the holy house, and adored it, and wished that the robbers would repent before their miseries became incurable. Now Titus was deeply affected with this state of things, and reproached John and his party, and said to them, quote, "Have not you, vile wretches that you are, by our permission, put up this partition wall before your sanctuary? Have not you been allowed to put up the pillars thereto belonging at due distances, and on it engrave in Greek, and in your own letters, this prohibition, that no foreigner should go beyond that wall? Have not we given you leave to kill such as go beyond it, though he were a Roman? And what do you now do, you pernicious villains? Why do you trample upon dead bodies in this temple? And why do you pollute this holy house with the blood of both foreigners and Jews themselves? I appeal to the gods of my own country, and to every god that ever had any regard to this place, for I do not suppose it now be regarded by any of them. I also appeal to my own army, and to those Jews that are now with me, and even to yourselves, that I do not force you to defile your sanctuary. And if you will but change the place whereon you will fight, no Roman shall either come near your sanctuary, or offer any affront to it. Nay, I will endeavor to preserve your holy house, whether you will or not." As Josephus explained these things from the mouth of Caesar, both the robbers and the tyrant thought that these exhortations proceeded from Titus's fear, and not from his good will to them, and grew insolent upon it. But when Titus saw that these men were neither to be moved by commiseration toward themselves, nor had any concern upon them to have the holy house spared, he proceeded unwillingly to go on again with the war against them. He could not indeed bring all his army against them, the place was so narrow, but choosing 30 soldiers of the most valiant out of every 100, and committing 1,000 to each tribune, and making Cerealis their commander-in-chief, he gave orders that they should attack the guards of the temple about the 9th hour of that night. But as he was now in his armor and preparing to go down with them, his friends would not let him go, by reason of the greatness of the danger, and what the commanders suggested to them. For they said that he would do more by sitting above in the tower of Antonia, as a dispenser of rewards to those soldiers that signalized themselves in the fight, than by coming down and hazarding his own person in the forefront of them, for that they would all fight stoutly while Caesar looked upon them. With this advice Caesar complied, and said that the only reason he had for such compliance with the soldiers was this, that he might be able to judge their courageous actions, and that no valiant soldier might lie concealed and miss of his reward, and no cowardly soldier might go unpunished, but that he might himself be an eyewitness, and able to give evidence of all that was done, and who was to be the disposer of punishments and rewards to them. So he sent the soldiers about their work at the hour forementioned, while he himself went to a higher place in the tower of Antonia, whence he might see what was done, and there waited with impatience to see the event. However, the soldiers that were sent did not find the guards of the temple asleep, as they hoped to have done, but were obliged to fight with them immediately hand to hand, as they rushed with violence upon them with a great shout. Now as soon as the rest within the temple heard that shout of those that were upon the watch, they ran out in troops upon them. Then did the Romans receive the onset of those that came first upon them, but those that followed them fell upon their own troops, and many of them treated their own soldiers as if they had been enemies, for the great confused noise that was made on both sides hindered them from distinguishing one another's voices, as did the darkness of the night hinder them from the like distinction by the sight, besides that blindness which arose otherwise also from the passion and fear that they were in at the same time, for which reason it was all one to the soldiers who it was they struck at. However, this ignorance did less harm to the Romans than to the Jews, because they were joined together under their shields, and made their sallies more regularly than others did, and each of them remembered their watchword, while the Jews were perpetually dispersed abroad, and made their attacks and retreats at random, and so did frequently seem to one another to be enemies, for every one of them received those of their own men that came back in the dark as Romans, and made an assault upon them, so that more of them were wounded by their own men than by the enemy, till upon the coming of the day, the nature of the right was discerned by the eye afterward. Then did they stand in battle array in distinct bodies, and cast their darts regularly, and regularly defended themselves, nor did either side yield or grow weary. The Romans contended with each other who should fight the most strenuously, both single men and entire regiments, as being under the eye of Titus, and every one concluded that this day would begin his promotion if he fought bravely. What were the great encouragements of the Jews to act vigorously were their fear for themselves and for the temple, and the presence of their tyrant, who exhorted some and beat and threatened others to act courageously. Now it so happened that this fight was for the most part a stationary one, wherein the soldiers went on and came back in a short time and suddenly, for there was no long space of ground for either of their flights or pursuits. But still there was a tumultuous noise among the Romans from the tower of Antonia, who loudly cried out upon all occasions to their own men to press on courageously, when they were too hard for the Jews, and to stay when they were retiring backward, so that here was a kind of theater of war, for what was done in this fight could not be concealed from either from Titus or from those that were about him. At length it appeared that this fight, which began at the 9th hour of the night, was not over till past the 5th hour of the day, and that in the same place where the battle began, neither party could say that they had made the other to retire, but both armies left the victory almost in uncertainty between them, wherein those that signalized themselves on the Roman side were a great many, but on the Jewish side, and those that were with Simon, Judas the son of Murto, and Simon the son of Josephus, and of the Idumeans, James and Simon, the latter of whom was the son of Catholicus, and James was the son of Sosas, of those that were with John, Gyptheus and Alexis, and of the zealots Simon the son of Jairus. In the meantime, the rest of the Roman army had, in 7 days' time, overthrown some foundations of the tower of Antonia, and had made a ready and broad way to the temple. Then did the legions come near the first court, and began to raise their banks. The one bank was over against the northwest corner of the inner temple, another was at that northern edifice which was between the two gates, and the other of the two, one was at the western cloister of the outer court of the temple, and the other against its northern cloister. However, these works were thus far advanced by the Romans, not without great pains and difficulty, particularly by being obliged to bring their materials from the distance of 100 furlongs. They had further difficulties also upon them, sometimes by their overgreat security that they were in, that they should overcome the Jewish snares laid for them, and by that boldness of the Jews which their despair of escaping had inspired them withal. For some of their horsemen, when they went out to gather wood or hay, let the horses feed without having their bridles on, during the time of foraging, upon which horses the Jews sallied out in whole bodies, and seized them. And when this was continually done, and Caesar believed that what the truth was, that the horses were stolen more by negligence of his own men than by the valor of the Jews, he determined to use greater severity to oblige the rest to take care of their horses. So he commanded that one of those soldiers who had lost their horses should be capitally punished, whereby he so terrified the rest that they preserved their horses for the time to come, for they did not any longer let them go from them to feed by themselves, but, as if they had grown to them, they went always along with them when they wanted necessaries. Thus did the Romans still continue to make war against the temple, and to raise their banks against it. Now after 1 day had been interposed since the Romans ascended the breach, many of the seditious were so pressed by the famine upon the present failure of their ravages, that they got together, and made an attack on those Roman guards that were upon the Mount of Olives, and this about the 11th hour of the day, as supposing first that they would not expect such an onset, and in the next place that they were taking care of their bodies, and that therefore they should easily beat them. But the Romans were apprised of their coming to attack them beforehand, and running together from the neighboring camps on the sudden, prevented them from getting over their fortification, or forcing the wall that was built around them. Upon this came a sharp fight, and here many great actions were performed on both sides, while the Romans showed both their courage and their skill in war, as did the Jews come on them with immoderate violence and intolerable passion. The one part were urged on by shame, and the other by necessity. For it seemed a very shameful thing to the Romans to let the Jews go. Now they were taken in a kind of net, while the Jews had but one hope of saving themselves, and that was in case they could by violence break through the Roman wall, and whose name was Pedanius, belonging to a party of horsemen, when the Jews were already beaten and forced down into the valley together, spurred his horse on their flank with great vehemence, and caught up a certain young man belonging to the enemy by his ankle as he was running away. The man was, however, of a robust body, and in his army. So low did Pedanius bend himself downward from his horse even as he was galloping away, and so great was the strength of his right hand and of the rest of his body, and also such skill as he had in horsemanship. So this man seized upon that his prey, and upon a precious treasure, and carried him as his captive to Caesar. Whereupon Titus admired the man that had seized the other for his great strength, and ordered the man that was caught to be punished with death for his attempt against the Roman wall, but betook himself to the siege of the temple, and pressing on the raising of the banks. In the meantime, the Jews were so distressed by the fights they had been in, as the war advanced higher and higher, and creeping up to the holy house itself, that they, as it were, cut off those limbs of their body which were infected, in order to prevent the distemper spreading further. For they set the northwest cloister, which was joined to the tower of Antonia, on fire, and after that brake off about 20 cubits of that cloister, and thereby made a beginning in burning the sanctuary. 2 days after which, on the 24th day of the aforementioned month, Panemus or Tammuz, the Romans set fire to the cloister that joined to the other, when the fire went 15 cubits farther. The Jews in like manner cut off its roof, nor did they entirely leave off that they were about till the tower of Antonia was parted from the temple, even when it was in their power to have stopped the fire. Nay, they lay still while the temple was set on fire, and deemed this spreading of the fire to be for their own advantage. However, the armies were still fighting one against another about the temple, and the war was managed by continual sallies of particular parties against one another. Now there was at this time a man among the Jews, low of stature he was, and of despicable appearance, and of no character either as to his family or in other respects. His name was Jonathan. He went out at the high priest John's monument, and uttered many other insolent things to the Romans, and challenged the best of them all to single combat. But many of those that stood there in the army huffed him, and many of them, as they might well be, were afraid of him. Some of them also reasoned thus, and justly enough, that it was not fit to fight with a man that desired to die, because those that utterly despaired of deliverance had, besides other passions, a violence in attacking men that could not be opposed, and had no regard to God himself, and to that than that to hazard oneself with a person whom, if you overcome, you do no great matter, and by whom it is hazardous that you may be taken prisoner, would be an instance, not of manly courage, but of unmanly rashness. So there being nobody that came out to accept the man's challenge, and the Jew cutting them with a great number of reproaches as cowards, for he is a very haughty man in himself, and a great despiser of the Romans, one whose name was Pudens, of the body of horsemen, out of his abomination of the other's words, and of his impudence withal, and perhaps out of an inconsiderate arrogance, on account of the other's lowness of stature, ran out to him, and was too hard for him in other respects, but was betrayed by his ill fortune, for he fell down, and as he was down, Jonathan came running to him and cut his throat, and then, standing upon his dead body, he brandished his sword, bloody as it was, and shook his shield with his left hand, and made many acclamations to the Roman army, and exulted over the dead man, and jested upon the Romans, till at length one Priscus, a centurion, shot a dart at him as he was leaping and playing the fool with himself, and thereby pierced him through, upon which a shout was set up by both by the Jews and by the Romans, though on different accounts. So Jonathan grew giddy by the pain of his wounds, and fell down upon the body of his adversary, as a plain instance how suddenly vengeance may come upon men that have success in war without any just deserving the same. Chapter 3, concerning a stratagem that was devised by the Jews, by which they burnt many of the Romans, with another description of the terrible famine that was in the city. But now the seditious that were in the temple did every day openly endeavor to beat off the soldiers that were upon the banks, and on the 27th day of the forenamed month, Panemus, or Tammuz, contrived such a stratagem as this. They filled that part of the western cloister which was between the beams and the roof under them with dry materials, as also with bitumen and pitch, and then retired from that place as though they were tired with the pains they had taken. At which procedure of theirs many of the most inconsiderate among the Romans, who were carried away with violent passions, followed hard after them as they were retiring, and applied ladders to the cloister, and got up to it suddenly. But the prudent part of them, when they understood this unaccountable retreat of the Jews, stood still where they were before. However, the cloister was full of those that were gone up the ladders, at which time the Jews set it all on fire, and as the flame burst out everywhere on the sudden, the Romans that were out of the danger were seized with a very great consternation, as were those that were in the midst of the danger in the utmost distress. So when they perceived themselves surrounded with the flames, some of them threw themselves down backwards into the city, and some among their enemies in the temple, as did many leap down to their own men, and broke their limbs to pieces. But a great number of those that were going to take these violent methods were prevented by the fire, though some prevented the fire by their own swords. However, the fire was on the sudden carried so far as to surround those who would have otherwise perished. As for Caesar himself, he could not, however, but commiserate those that had thus perished, although they got up thither without any order for so doing, since there was no way of giving them any relief. Yet it was this some comfort to those that were destroyed, that everybody might see that person grieve, for whose sake they came to their end. For he cried out openly to them and leapt up, and exhorted those that were about him to do their utmost to relieve them. So every one of them died cheerfully, as carrying along with him these words and this intention of Caesar as a sepulchral monument. Some there were indeed who retired into the wall of the cloister, which was broad, and were preserved out of the fire, but were then surrounded by the Jews. And although they made resistance against the Jews for a long time, yet they were wounded by them, and at length they all fell down dead. At the last, a young man among them, whose name was Longus, became a decoration to the sad affair, while every one of them that perished were worthy of a memorial. This man appeared to deserve it beyond all the rest. Now the Jews admired this man for his courage, and were further desirous of having him slain. So they persuaded him to come down to them, upon security given him for his life. But Cornelius, his brother, persuaded him, on the contrary, not to tarnish his own glory, nor that of the Roman army. He complied with this last advice, and lifting up his sword before both armies, slew himself. Yet there was one Artorius among those surrounded by the fire who escaped by his subtlety. For when he had with a loud voice called to him Lucius, one of his fellow soldiers that lay with him in the same tent, and said to him, I do leave thee heir of all I have, if thou wilt come and receive me. Upon this he came running to receive him readily. Artorius then threw himself down upon him and saved his own life, while he that received him was dashed so vehemently against the stone pavement by the other's weight that he died immediately. This melancholy accident made the Romans sad for a while, but still it made them more upon their guard for the future, and was of advantage to them against the delusions of the Jews, by which they were greatly damaged through their unacquaintedness with the places and with the nature of the inhabitants. Now this cloister was burnt down as far as John's tower, which he built in the war he made against Simon over the gates that led to the Xystus. The Jews also cut off the rest of that cloister from the temple, after they had destroyed those that got up to it. But the next day the Romans burnt down the northern cloister entirely, as far as the east cloister, whose common angle joined to the valley that was called Cedron, and was built over it, on which account the depth was frightful. And this was the state of the temple at that time. Now those that perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of any kind of food did anywhere appear, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell a-fighting one with another about it, snatching from each other the most miserable supports of life. Nor would men believe that those who were dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were expiring, lest any one should have concealed food in their bosoms, and counterfeited dying. Nay, these robbers gaped for want, and ran about stumbling and staggering along like mad dogs, and reeling against the doors of the houses like drunken men. They would also, in the great distress they were in, rush into the very same houses 2 or 3 times in one and the same day. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles and shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed. The very wisps of old hay became food to some, and some gathered up fibers, and sold a very small weight of them for 4 attic or drachma. But why do I describe the shameless impudence of the famine brought on men in their eating inanimate things, while I am going to relate a matter of fact, the like to which no history relates either among the Greeks or barbarians? It is horrible to speak of it, and incredible when heard. I had indeed willingly omitted this calamity of ours, that I might not seem to deliver what is so portentous to posterity, but that I have innumerable witnesses to it in my own age. And besides, my country would have little reason to thank me for suppressing the miseries that she underwent at this time. There was a certain woman that dwelt beyond Jordan. Her name was Mary. Her father was Eleazar of the village Bethazob, which signifies the house of hyssop. She was eminent for her family and her wealth, and had fled away to Jerusalem with the rest of the multitude, and was with them besieged therein at this time. The other effects of this woman had been already seized upon, such as I mean she had brought with her out of Perea, and moved into the city. What she had treasured up besides, also what food she had contrived to save, had also been carried off by the rapacious guards, who came every day running into her house for that purpose. This put the poor woman into a very great passion, and by the frequent reproaches and imprecations she cast at those rapacious villains, she had provoked them to anger against her, but none of them, either out of the indignation she had raised against herself, or out of commiseration of her case, would take away her life. And if she found any food, she perceived her labors were for others, not for herself. And it was now become impossible for her, anyway, to find any more food, while the famine pierced through her very bowels and marrow, when also her passion was fired to a degree beyond the famine itself. Nor did she consult with anything but with her passion, and the necessity she was in. She then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, who was a child sucking at her breast, she said, quote, "O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. This famine will also destroy us, even before that slavery comes upon us. Yet are these seditious rogues more terrible than both the other. Come on, be thou my food, and be thou a fury to those seditious varlets, and a byword to the world, which is all that is now wanting to complete the calamities of us Jews." Unquote. As soon as she said this, she slew her son, then roasted him, and ate the one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed. Upon this seditious came in presently, and smelling the horrid scent of this food, they threatened her that they would cut her throat immediately if she did not show them what food she had gotten ready. She replied that she had saved a very fine portion of it for them, and withal uncovered what was left of her son. Hereupon they were seized with a horror and amazement of mind, and stood astonished at the sight, when she said to them, quote, "This is mine own son, and what hath been done was mine own doing. Come, eat of this food, for I have eaten of it myself." Unquote. Do not pretend to be either more tender than a woman, or more compassionate than a mother, but if you be so scrupulous, and do abominate this my sacrifice, as I have eaten the other half, let the rest be reserved for me also. Unquote. After which those men went out trembling, being never so much affrighted at anything as they were at this, and with some difficulty they left the rest of that meat to the mother. Upon which the whole city was full of this horrid action immediately, and while everybody laid this miserable case before their own eyes, they trembled, as if this unheard of action had been done by themselves. So those that were thus distressed by the famine were very desirous to die, and those already dead were esteemed happy, because they had not lived long enough either to hear or to see such miseries. This sad instance was quickly told to the Romans, some of whom could not believe it, and others pitied the distress which the Jews were under. But there were many of them who were hereby induced to a more bitter hatred than ordinary against our nation. But for Caesar he excused himself before God as to this matter, and said that he had proposed peace and liberty to the Jews, as well as an oblivion of all their former insolent practices, but that they, instead of concord, had chosen sedition, instead of peace, war, and before satiety and abundance, a famine. that they had begun with their own hands to burn down that temple which we have preserved hitherto, and that heretofore they deserved to eat such food as this was. That, however, this horrid action of eating an own child ought to be covered with the overthrow of their very country itself, and men ought not to leave such a city upon the habitable earth to be seen by the sun, wherein mothers are thus fed, although such food be fitter for the fathers than for the mothers to eat of, since it is they that continue still in a state of war against us, after they have undergone such miseries as these. And at the same time that he said this, he reflected on the desperate condition these men must be in, nor could he expect that such men could be recovered to sobriety of mind after they had endured these very sufferings, for the avoiding whereof it was only probable that they might have repented.